everyone to today's Project WiCCED seminar. We are really pleased to have Christina McGranigan talk today. If you haven't met Christina, that's probably because she came to University of Delaware during the pandemic. And unless you're in the halls of Townsend, you don't probably see her very often, but I do encourage people to get to know her. She is a fantastic young economist who comes to us through Cornell University, where she got her PhD. And she has a lot of expertise on environmental and resource issues, special interest in energy economics, which is a fantastic field. Today, she'll be talking about some of her recent work on thinking about coastal buyouts, because as we saw, hopefully people had a chance to see in this past week, the Washington Post article. There was a headline article about the challenges of protecting infrastructure during coastal floods, and all the articles pictures were about Delaware. Actually, you would see areas around Taylor's Bridge or Odessa, and it was a whole bunch of kind of a case study on it. Though the issues are broadly, as they think about the infrastructure bill going through Congress, how do you protect them with a changing climate and sea level rise? And one of the things that's discussed is, are some areas need to be bought out? Are all of these defensible places that we can provide safe harbor for people during storms, or is it time to let more natural systems going forward? So Christina, I don't know if you had any control over that Washington Post article from 2 days ago, but certainly we couldn't have anything more timely than your research on it. So we're thrilled to have you be a part of Project WiCCED. We're happy that you're here at the University of Delaware, and I'll pass the floor on over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ken. That was a well-timed article. And I'm really excited to be presenting here today to the project seminar series. This talk is co-authored work with Stephen Otto, who is now at ISO New England, but was a student with me at Cornell University. And what we're exploring here is the effect of choice uncertainty on valuations. And I will define all these terms in a moment, and why you should care about this, this effect in the context of coastal buyouts, as Ken said. So first of all, in terms of motivation, Kent already pointed this out, but Delaware is quite susceptible to sea level rise, which is a result of climate change. And so Delaware in particular is the lowest lying state in the nation. More than 331 square miles of land and 621 miles of roadway are located in the floodplain. And a lot of Delawareans actually support the end of construction in flood-prone areas. So Delawareans are aware of these risks, but a lot of areas that have already developed are quite susceptible to sea level rise. Now, we can adapt to sea level rise in many different forms, as you are all probably familiar with. So we can take defensive approaches. We can try to protect areas through seawalls or levees, or by elevating homes and roads. Or we can take more proactive approaches, such as managed retreat, and trying to relocate communities through voluntary buyout programs. In either case, what we need to do is decide how we're going to allocate any funds that are available between the different communities that are affected by sea level rise. And then once we've decided which communities we want to target, we need to encourage these communities to actually adopt the proposed solutions that we have laid out for them. So in particular, if we think about coastal buyout programs, the definition is here on the slide. So it's a purposeful relocation of residents and infrastructure away from hazardous areas. And the goal is to provide coastal homeowners with an alternative to repairing and rebuilding residences that keep repeatedly and severely damaged through storms and floods. There are distinct benefits to using coastal buyout programs. For example, we can enhance community resilience by protecting homes that are at risk. We can reduce public expenditures. So think about a neighborhood that's supported by a road and other urban infrastructure, or by a bridge. So we can potentially remove that if the neighborhood is relocated. And then we also might benefit from healthier coastal landscapes. So if we are able to move some homes to alternative locations, we can then convert that land into open space. That open space can serve as wetland, which will prevent floods to other homes that remain in the area. And it can also turn into things like coastal parks and other recreation areas for other people. But of course, there are also challenges with this approach. And so first of all, we need to obtain financing to be able to buy out homes, which can be quite expensive. Once we have funding, we still need to overcome low participation rates, which is a problem we see in practice. And so in particular, well, as I'll discuss in a second, there's a risk that we get temporal and spatial fragmentation of different homes accepting and others not accepting, which can lead to a phenomenon called checkerboarding. And then once we've acquired all this land, we need to find a way to use it productively. So in related research, that's not the topic of today, but I'm working on with Kent and Leah and other people in this group at Project WiCCED. We're focusing on how we can design more cost-effective buyout mechanisms, so how to approach homeowners in order to encourage them to participate in buyout programs that are voluntary in order to prevent checkerboarding. And so this image here is supposed to illustrate the idea of a small coastal neighborhood that has just a few homes, is supported by a public road and a public bridge. And so if we go up to these homeowners and offer them money for their homes, then we might find that some homeowners accept and others don't. And so some homeowners will move away and some homeowners will stay. And so we would still need all of that public infrastructure to support the smaller number of homeowners that stay. The other disadvantage of this checkerboarding pattern is that in this case, it might be hard to convert the land that we acquired into wetland because there's just not enough contiguous space. And so in related research, we're exploring things like auctions, spatial constraints, or paying bonuses to people who coordinate with their neighbors in order to prevent checkerboarding. Now in the research today, I'm going to focus on a different aspect, and it's going to be focusing on how to determine which communities we should target in the first place. And so a lot of times, one of the tools we can use for that is something like cost-benefit analysis. So understanding which coastal areas are easily going to be turned into valuable space that can be used as a recreation area or park. It can also be valuations in the form of getting homeowners to value different types of innovative approaches to coastal buyouts. So there's a paper that's coming out in Land Economics this year. That's by Ando and Reeser. And what they're looking at is an innovative contract that's essentially a pre-flood agreement to relocate. So you're going up to a homeowner and saying, agree now that if your home gets damaged and meets the substantial damage threshold, which is 50% of value loss in a flood event. So if your home meets that threshold, you agree now that you will sell as your home then at a fixed price. And so in this paper by Ando and Reeser, what they do is they go up to homeowners and get them to value this contract in order to understand how valuable it is to homeowners. And so in all of these contexts, what we're relying on is people valuing goods. And so valuing goods can be quite easy. The easiest way to value a good would be just to look at its market price. But in a lot of these cases, market prices aren't observable. So in a lot of these coastal adaptation contexts, we're dealing with non-market goods that aren't actually transacted in a market. And so we're going to need to look for alternative approaches. And so there are a list of different approaches that are used in economics to deal with these type of non-market goods. And so in particular, two broad categories. One of them is revealed preferences. So maybe the good isn't traded, but maybe we can find some way in which the good is still indirectly exchanged. So if you think about hedonic pricing, the most classic example of this would be something like air quality. So there is no market for air quality, but air quality is baked into a lot of different things that people do transact on markets, including things like houses. And so if we can take data on differential air quality and differential housing prices, then we can try to come up with a causal analysis to infer how much of the air quality is baked into the price of a home. Another revealed preference approach is the travel cost method. So maybe we can't see how much people value national parks, but we can see how far they were willing to travel and how much they were willing to pay for that travel. And that can give us an idea for how much enjoyment they're deriving from the national park. And then finally, there's averting behavior. So think about water filters. So there's no market for water quality, but we can see how much people are willing to pay to avoid bad quality water. So those are revealed preference approaches. And an alternative to that would just be to have people directly state their preferences. Again, there are two types of methods under that. There would be discrete choice experiments where we essentially decompose products into attributes, vary the different attributes and give people different choice sets from which they can choose to try to understand how they value the different attributes of a good. Or we can just value the whole good at once in a holistic valuation setting. And that's often called contingent valuation. Contingent because it's contingent on us exactly describing the good that we care about. So we're going to say, we want you to value a coastal park that's going to come up in this specific area where there's currently homes, but we're going to convert it into a park. And we're going to describe exactly how that park is going to look, how big it's going to be, and how you might be able to use it. So contingent on that description, how much do you value that park? So we're going to focus in on contingent valuation in this talk. Contingent valuation is especially useful for, as we said, non-market goods, particularly if they have high non-use values, which can make it harder to find revealed preference solutions. And it's also really helpful if the changes that we care about, so for example, turning land into a public park, kind of lies outside of the range of available data that we could find revealed preference information for. Contingent valuation is generally accepted by courts in the United States. Mike, question.
Thanks, Christina. I'm wondering, so when you're talking about contingent valuation, we're talking about valuing or trying to find a price for what exactly? You you have I'm assuming on the one hand, you have the purchasing price of the house that you might want to, or that some kind of policy is targeting. But so what, could you, I'm a little lost is what I'm saying. What are you valuing here right now? Why are you determining what are you determining the value of, and for what?
So there are various examples in the coastal setting. So you could think about something like a seawall. So it's easy for us to determine what the cost of the seawall is, but in a cost benefit analysis, we would want to weigh that against the benefits from the seawall. And so as part of that, we would probably want to understand how much people value, say, the boardwalk for the town that's currently being protected. So the people in the town itself will care about the value of their homes, but other people will visit that boardwalk. And so we might have to understand how much value people derive from the boardwalk when we do the cost benefit analysis. Similarly, in the Endo paper, they're using contingent valuation to understand how homeowners value this kind of like almost option contract of agreeing now to sell your home conditional on substantial damage later. So that's another type of valuation study where they use contingent valuation to better understand homeowner behavior. If you think about something like an auction too, if we think about doing auctions to have people sell us their homes, we're essentially asking people to put a value on their home. They could just tell us the market price. They probably don't do that because they probably value it quite differently from the market price. And so that's another case where we want to understand exactly how people put a price tag on something. Okay, a great question. Okay, any other questions at this point? Okay. And so, as I said, contingent valuation is generally accepted by courts in the US. And so NOAA had a blue ribbon panel which determined that it's a valid method to use for water pollution and water quality. And this idea was also upheld in a legal case, Ohio versus the Department of the Interior, which allowed this type of valuation as evidence. On the other hand, contingent valuation tends to be slightly less accepted by lawmakers. And in particular, it's frequently criticized for being sensitive to how the question is framed. And that's going to be the focus of this talk. So I'll go exactly into this criticism in a moment. But broadly, the goal of this study that I'm going to describe is to explore a potential driver of a commonly cited framing effect in stated valuations. And so I'll give you that background now. So if we're thinking about people valuing goods, there are two dimensions that we need to think about. First of all, we want to think about, is the good that we're valuing an improvement or a degradation? So if you think about environmental context, you could think about something like pollution. So we might have an oil spill, and so that would be a form of environmental degradation. So that's one dimension. Is it an improvement, degradation? And then also, what's the property right? Do you have the right to the clean beach, or do you not have the right to the clean beach to begin with? And that's going to determine which measure we want to use. So if you think about the measure on the top right, here is the property right is for somebody to have a clean beach, for a degraded environment. So you don't have the right to a clean beach, but we can ask you how much you would be willing to pay to have the beach cleaned up. Bottom left would be something like, you have the right to a clean beach, and we would ask you how much would you be willing to accept to tolerate some pollution on the clean beach that you currently have. And then the opposite corners would just be to not get this improvement. So you have the right to an improvement. How much would you be willing to accept not to get that improvement that you have the right to obtain? Now, as you can see, there's a difference in measure, this willingness to accept, willingness to pay difference between the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the table. So as a function of who has the property right, do you have the right to the clean environment or the degraded environment? That's going to determine how we should ask this question in theory. And what the Coase theorem in economics tells us is essentially, it doesn't really matter how you assign property rights, you're going to get the same outcome in the end. So willingness to accept and willingness to pay should be the same. And it shouldn't matter in what context we're asking this question, because we're asking you exactly to value, let's say, a clean beach. Willingness to accept and willingness to pay should come out to be the same. There are a lot of studies that show that in practice, that's actually often not the case. And so this line of literature started with Hammack and Brown in 1974. And what they were looking at was how people value hunting of waterfowl. And so they were doing a survey to try to understand how much people value the recreational amenity of hunting. And so they asked the question of, imagine you've currently hunted 6 waterfowls. How much would you be willing to pay for a 7th waterfowl? And then they also tried just a different frame, saying, imagine you had the chance to hunt 7. How much would you be willing to accept to only hunt 6? Now, going from 6 to 7 is kind of the question that they're asking either way. It's just framed differently. And they actually got very different answers. And that started this whole literature on whether being in the position of a buyer or a seller, or being in the position of being asked for willingness to accept or willingness to pay, actually affects people's valuations. And as I said, the implications are relevant because it kind of goes against the Coase theorem in economics, which supposes that property rights doesn't matter whether you're a buyer or a seller, doesn't matter for what value you should say. And it can also lead to undertrading because now there's a gap between buyer and seller valuations. And so buyers and sellers are less likely to agree on a price. This was then formalized in the 1980s through a series of lab experiments. And then Kahneman et al. Actually termed the term endowment effect for this phenomenon that willingness to accept tends to be higher than willingness to pay. This was kind of in their mind linked to the idea of loss aversion. So if you currently have the property right, you currently own something, giving it up feels much worse than gaining something new. And so they linked it to loss aversion, but there are now a lot of different explanations for this effect that don't necessarily have to do with loss aversion. And we're going to explore one in this paper. And so there are two different paradigms under which you can test this difference in valuations. There's the valuation paradigm, just ask people willingness to accept and willingness to pay and compare the two. And there's the exchange paradigm where we directly look at people's trading choices. And so to illustrate that, imagine that we had a population of 10 people and people either prefer dark blue or light blue. And so in this population, it happens to be that 2 people prefer dark and 2 people prefer light. Then we're going to randomly assign them items that are dark or light. And so it's complete random assignment to these people. And then we're going to ask who's going to want to exchange their item in this case. So whenever we've mismatched somebody in terms of their preference and the item they were assigned, they should be wanting to trade. And in this case, this would be the dark blue person who received a light blue item, and then all these light blue persons who received a dark blue item. And so it should be roughly half of the people in this population should be wanting to trade. And that's just because we've randomly assigned the item. It doesn't matter how the distribution of preferences was at the start. Random assignment should always mean 50% of people want to exchange the randomly assigned good. And that's going to be tested as an exchange paradigm. So this idea of the endowment effect became quite prominent in the field of contingent valuations through the Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989, which happened in Alaska. And a lot of the coast of Alaska was actually covered in oil at this point. And so people tried to use contingent valuation to understand what kind of damage was done by this oil spill. And Exxon actually contested in court the use of contingent valuation, saying because of this endowment effect, because framing the question as property rights as a seller or a buyer affects valuations, we shouldn't trust these valuations at all, and try to not have this allowed in court. And this type of critique is particularly relevant in environmental contexts where they were easily able to make this claim because they could say people don't really know this speech, they don't go regularly to the speech, and so the valuations that they're giving are somewhat biased simply because they don't understand the value that they're the item that they're valuing. And so the same is kind of true for coastal environments. It's probably pretty hard for people to value something like a seawall because they've never been asked to value a seawall before. Similarly, if you ask them to value a new type of buyout contract that's conditional on damages later, it's probably challenging for people to come up with a valuation for that because there's a lot of uncertainty in the type of item that you're describing to them. And so in this study, what we want to understand is, does this type of uncertainty, does choice uncertainty, explain part of this difference between stated preferences for buyers and sellers? And the main findings in the study is that choice uncertainty does indeed create valuation asymmetries. In particular, it does so by driving up willingness to accept by sellers for their goods. It also leads to undertrading, just as predicted by theory. And we find that both product and value uncertainty seem to play a role in creating these asymmetries. And so just to give you a few more definitions up front before we dive in the realm of uncertainty here, we want to distinguish between institutional or trade uncertainty. That's whenever you're unsure about how the market works. You're not sure if there are transaction costs and so on. Or choice uncertainty, the one we focus on, and that's you're unsure about the product or its attributes. You're unsure about the environment in which the product will be consumed. So that would be extrinsic uncertainty. Or intrinsic uncertainty, you know what the product is, you know when you will consume it and in what context, but you don't know how to put a price tag on it. Now, there's a lot of related literature on this topic. If you Google on Google Scholar search for the endowment effect, there's I think about 22,000 studies that come up. And if you Google endowment effect and uncertainty, 13,000 studies still come up. So it's a very broad space. And I might not be citing your favorite studies on this topic here, but most of that literature is focused on the side of trade uncertainty. So the idea is that because people are unfamiliar with trading these items, that's why we see this big gap form. And so List in particular had 2 famous studies on this where he was dealing with people trading baseball cards, and he showed that more experienced baseball card traders exhibited less of an endowment effect. And Engelman and Hollard kind of did a nice lab experiment in 2010 where they forced some people to trade and showed that that also had an effect on the amount of value disparity between willingness to accept and willingness to pay. But there's much less on this idea of choice uncertainty in this field. And so there are two really relevant studies to us, Bateman et al. And Kingsley and Brown. And so what Bateman do is they think about this idea of valuing an environmental amenity, something like, let's say, a seawall. And so what they do is they actually use virtual reality as a tool to get people more familiar with the product they're supposed to think about. And they show that once if you describe something verbally versus if you describe something using virtual reality, then virtual reality really supports a narrowing of that gap between valuations for willingness to accept and willingness to pay. Kingsley and Brown care more about this idea of mapping an item into money. So they show that if you train people on how to map different products into money, they get better and better at not having an endowment effect if you ask them about even a less familiar good. And then finally, there are studies on how these types of endowment effects get incorporated into contingent valuation and how we should think about which measure to use in which context. Yes, Mike.
Sorry for interrupting again, Christina. When you talk about a narrowing of the gap between those two, do you know by any chance whether we're talking about a decrease in willingness to accept or an increase in willingness to pay? Which way does it, do you know which way it goes?
So that's a great question. It's usually, the criticism is usually that willingness to accept is the more unreliable measure and that it tends to be artificially high. And so in the Johnston et al. Study, they say that for most contexts, you should be using willingness to pay, even if the question is, how much would you be willing to accept for a damage? And we kind of find evidence for that in this study here too. So we find that in the presence of choice uncertainty, what you're doing is you're driving up extreme willingness to accept answers. And once you alleviate that, they kind of come back closer together. So willingness to accept certainly seems to be the more sensitive measure, and maybe because people aren't often in the position of sellers.
Thank you.
Great question. Okay, so the basic setup of this study is we ran a series of lab experiments in Cornell's LEADER lab. The good we used, because we couldn't really use a real seawall, was chocolate. And so we used different types of chocolate in this experiment. The treatment to reduce choice uncertainty is going to be tasting the chocolate. And then we're going to do this test under the two different paradigms, so under Valuation Paradigm and Exchange Paradigm. And we're going to start by looking at the results of our Valuation Paradigm. So here's the setup of the study. So students came into the lab, and then we randomly split them to be buyers or sellers. If you're a seller, we're going to ask you for your willingness to accept to give up chocolate. If you're a buyer, we're going to ask you for your willingness to pay to buy some chocolate from us. And so sellers in the willingness to accept arm get endowed with chocolate as soon as they enter the lab. Then everybody does some practice rounds on the screen where they value some financial assets. These were just very simple lotteries that were described to all of the participants. And then we again split our sample into the tasting versus non-tasting treatment arms. And so part of the sellers and part of the buyers get to taste chocolate before making their decision. They then report their valuations, and the rest of the participants don't get to taste, report their valuations, and then all the trades and payments get calculated at the end. And so here are the results from this experiment. So in the control group where people did not get the chance to taste the chocolate, we find a mean willingness to accept for the chocolate of $3.26 compared to a willingness to pay of 94 cents. And so we see a relatively large gap. So it's a willingness to accept, willingness to pay ratio of 3.47. That's relatively in line with the existing literature on endowment effects. And so that's for people who have not had a chance to taste this chocolate. If we look at the people who had the chance to taste the chocolate, we see a willingness to accept of 225 compared to a willingness to pay of 130. And so the willingness to accept, willingness to pay ratio is still larger than 1. The willingness to accept still exceeds willingness to pay, but it's now only 173 compared to 347 in the control group. And to Mike's point, what we saw in this case is that the willingness to accept, the average willingness to accept really came down, and the willingness to pay increased slightly. So people, the buyers were slightly positively surprised by the type of chocolate, and the sellers were slightly disappointed in the kind of chocolate we were giving them. So people were given a half bar of Ghirardelli chocolate, either dark or caramel in this case. And so here are just some two sample t-tests, very simply to kind of determine whether the differences between these groups are statistically significant. As you can see, there is a very statistically significant difference in willingness to accept and willingness to pay in our control group. So that's where we had that big ratio of 3.47. There's still a significant difference in the taste treatment group. Again, remember that we didn't get exactly a result of 1 for the willingness to accept, willingness to pay ratio, but it's less statistically significant than in the control. And what you can see is that the willingness to pay is the main thing that really doesn't seem to have a statistically significant difference. So willingness to pay does not seem to have moved very much, but we do see a somewhat statistically significant effect in willingness to accept at the 10% level. Here's the same result graphically. So here again is the average willingness to accept and willingness to pay by control, which is the no taste and taste group. Now you might ask yourself if what happened here is that really all of the sellers have reduced their willingness to accept by a little bit, and that's brought down the average, or is it really just extreme valuations that have moved? And so one way to think about that is we can use the willingness to accept and willingness to pay to draw supply and demand curves and see how many goods would have hypothetically been traded between the buyers and sellers in our room. And so in the control group, that number would have been 7. And in the taste group, the number actually only goes up to 8. And so the reason for that is that actually all we've done through the taste treatment is to reduce some of the more extreme valuations. So there's fewer people who are now as sellers saying that they value this chocolate at $8, $9, or $10. And so the number of trades actually doesn't increase that much, but extreme valuations is what has changed. Yeah.
Christina, you might have said this and I could have missed it, but did they know exactly what type of chocolate this was, or they just got a bar, they had no idea, and they were either not able to taste or taste? Like, did they know it was Ghirardelli, like all the information about it?
They did not. So they received the chocolate in a little brown paper bag.
Okay.
And they were allowed to touch that bag and weigh it in their hand, but they weren't able to see what was in the bag or weren't told what brand it was.
Okay, I missed that point. That's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so that was the valuation paradigm. And so now we'll think about the second paradigm, which is the exchange paradigm. So this time the experiment works as follows. We are endowing everybody who comes into the room randomly with one of 2 types of chocolate. So again, there's dark chocolate and there's caramel chocolate, and we do the random assignment of these types of chocolate to people. And remember that because we're doing random assignment, we assume that we've mismatched 50% of people in the room in terms of their actual chocolate preference. We then split people into a taste treatment and a non-taste treatment. In the taste treatment, they get to taste both the dark chocolate and the caramel chocolate. And in the other case, they only get a verbal description telling them that the dark chocolate has been described as rich and the caramel chocolate has been described as luxurious. They then complete a short survey that's really just meant to make the timeline between exchange and valuation paradigm roughly similar. And then they make an anonymous trading decision where they can put down on a little piece of paper whether they want to exchange their chocolate for the other type or not. Now, in this case, we see very different trade rates. So in the control, where people weren't able to taste the different types of chocolate, only 8% of people chose to exchange the item in their hand. It's not that surprising. You've really been given a little paper bag of chocolate and you asked if you want to exchange it for another paper bag. One has a circle stapled to it, one has a square stapled to it. You don't have any information really beyond that. And so we see a very low trade rate. And then once we let people taste the chocolate, they're really good at making a comparison of whether they prefer dark or caramel. And so we get very close to that hypothesized trade rate of 50%. Again, we can do some statistical tests to determine whether our results are significant. And so in particular, we can assess whether the number of trades in the population is equal to that expected 50%. In the control group, we can reject that very firmly. And in the treatment group, we can no longer reject that. We can also test whether the proportion of items the proportion of items traded is equal across the treatment group. Again, we can reject that. And then we can also reject that whether participants' choice of item is independent of the item they were assigned at the start. Now, what's interesting is we can put these 2 experiments next to each other because they kind of get at different aspects of this valuation difference. And so if you think about, so here's the graph that shows you the willingness to accept, willingness to pay ratio from the first experiment on the left, and then the exchange paradigm transaction shares on the right. And so as mentioned before, in the valuation paradigm, we see a much lower willingness to accept, willingness to pay ratio after the taste treatment. And in the exchange paradigm, as expected, we see a trade rate that's much closer to 50% in the taste treatment. And so what that means is that we got really close to the hypothetical ideal in the exchange setting, but we didn't quite get that close in the valuation setting. And so why are the 2 experiments different? Well, in a way, in the second experiment, we're asking people to map chocolate into chocolate. We're just saying, do you prefer dark chocolate to caramel or caramel to dark? Whereas in the first paradigm, they still have to map chocolate into money. And it seems that this residual act of having to map chocolate into money still means that there's a little bit of an endowment effect, even after you've tasted the chocolate. And so this relates to, this is also kind of related to findings that show that preference reversals exist. As a little bit technical, but the idea that if you make people choose something, it often looks different than if you ask them for valuations. And so to discuss this finding in the context here, first of all, a summary. So choice uncertainty does generate exchange and valuation asymmetries. And valuation asymmetries persist even when the product uncertainty is eliminated, which suggests that value uncertainty, so mapping goods into money, plays an important role in generating these valuation asymmetries. And this has important implications for contingent valuation studies, particularly in environmental economics. And so if we want to think about reducing choice uncertainty for, say, people asked to value a seawall, or somebody asked to think about a contract that has to do with their home flooding, it seems that this idea of value learning, of like repeatedly being exposed to the idea of valuing something so that you learn how to map it into money, and also the idea of giving them maybe virtual reality impressions of the item to reduce the choice uncertainty is important in order to improve quality of valuations, especially if you want to use willingness to accept as the measure of interest. But it's also important to point out that relying purely on this idea of valuations and cost-benefit logic may promote disproportionate retreat in low-income and minority communities. So while this research is looking at how we can improve cost-benefit analysis, only using cost-benefit analysis may not be the right approach for coastal settings. And then there's some important extensions that we could do. We could extend this research by trying to understand which mechanisms explain why choice uncertainty matters in this way. And we could also look at additional settings. For example, there's a paper by Corsi et al. That does a similar type of study, but in this case, the thing that people get to taste is actually a really bitter substance, so it's kind of a bad. And they find that that the endowment effect actually gets bigger once they taste. And so it would be interesting to see if this applies generally to bads or was just an outlier study. And that's all I have today.
Well, thank you, Christina. That was really great. Of course, I have to say that having this over the lunch hour and hearing you talk about chocolate the entire time was probably relatively unfortunate. It's one of those times where Zoom is probably not the right setting. And we could have all been together and eating some of these samples and seeing whether we prefer the dark or the caramel would have been really great. But it was great. It was great. Are there some questions that people have that they'd like to raise, either in the chat or just verbally?
To your point about chocolate, Kent, I actually had a lot left over after the experiments, and Dr. Paul received a lot of it. So there were beneficiaries at UD, just not today.
Mike, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Christina. Obviously for an experimental economist, this is, I find this really fascinating. I think I would love to have a conversation about your results where you can spend some time on it, because I really think it's interesting. I have been just fascinated by this difference and trying to understand more. And, anyway, I can, talk about this for, anyway, my question is, I do like the angle from an experimental perspective, from a behavioral perspective. I like the angle and looking at willingness to pay, willingness to accept differences in terms of a controlled lab environment with pieces of chocolate. Right? I find that's great. And there's a lot of control there, and there's a lot of, behaviorally that story makes a lot of sense. When you take this into a coastal buyout context, I wonder how much you're going to be able to extrapolate from your results, because I think there's a lot more that goes into this, right? You're talking about a person's culture, a person's identity, right? So the things that are fundamental to all of us, in many ways, the things that matter most to us as humans. So I wonder whether I'm sure you've thought about it. I'm sure maybe there's no answer, right? But can you say something about how you think those things that you suggested, like virtual reality displays, based on the stuff that was it Amy Ando that did this?
That was Bateman.
Oh, that was Ian Bateman. But so all of those, I find them really interesting. But just looking at what you did, where you think those if you think about reality, do you think it's going to hold up? I guess is my question. And if not, how?
That's a great question. And I totally agree with you. It's a much more complicated setting when people are valuing these much bigger coastal goods. And so if anything, I think like choice uncertainty has potentially plays an even bigger role there. So what we find, I think one of the key takeaways here is that the biggest problem really is with some really extreme valuations in terms of willingness to accept. And one of the reasons why people say don't use the willingness to accept measure is because you get these kind of outlier responses. And it seems that if you really frame the problem well, in our case, letting people taste things, and in Bateman's case, giving them these virtual reality experiences, it kind of reins in some of these extreme outlier observations. And so if you're in a case where you really think willingness to accept is the measure that you should use, then what we're advocating for is more of this both value learning and learning about the good, maybe through virtual reality. I think some of the things you mentioned do affect buyers and sellers probably in equal parts. But I agree that it's much more complicated, and because it's more complicated, there's more scope for some extreme responses. So we're not saying that, like, and in particular in the valuation setting, we're not saying that the endowment effect completely goes away. We still find an endowment effect even after tasting the chocolate, and potentially because mapping into money is hard. And so in a way, this is kind of a cautionary tale towards willingness to accept in its own way as well.
Christina, can I build upon that comment a little bit? You talked about, in general, we don't, for chocolate, right? Extreme values don't make a lot of sense because there's a market out there, right? There is Ghirardelli chocolate, and we don't see people paying thousands of dollars for it, right? There is no, there is, we don't see this in any real human economic behavior. But when I think about coastal environments, I see extreme outliers seem like pretty common, right? They wouldn't be people who want to never leave their community no matter what. I mean, I think you see that in downtown Detroit. No matter how bad things are going, you'll see some people say, I was born here, I'm going to live here. And you say, look at all these other economic opportunities that would be far better off to leave this community or leave Appalachia or whatever. And you see people just like absolutely being kind of these extreme views about their sense of place. I think I'd be worried if I had a measure that didn't capture that, because I would think that is a pretty common one, right? Again, maybe not for a market good that doesn't have, that has a whole bunch of other options out there, but for like a coastal home, even though there's a lot of homes out there, there's only one birthplace home or where I raise my kids or something. Can you reflect on, should we be getting rid of extremes, especially now in America, right? Where we seem like we got lots of extremes on one side or another, and that's a lot of behavior we're seeing.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm not saying that outliers shouldn't exist. I do think that some people have very high valuations for their homes, and those are their true preferences. So I'm not advocating for finding a measure that kind of like narrows the range of answers that we get, because those are valid answers. But to the extent that you're giving an extreme answer just because it's hard for you to imagine what we're even talking about, that's where we really want to advocate for providing more information and more kind of like visual or visceral forms to you. And so maybe the idea of like, if we can specify where you're going to relocate to, maybe like really giving you a good visual of that community that you're going to move to is going to change how much you say you're willing to accept to move change your home. And like, I don't think that the second valuation that you're giving us after this additional information has been manipulated by us in any way. I do think that's still a true preference. It's just hopefully a more informed preference.
Great, thanks. Jeremy, you have a question?
Yeah, I mean, I've done a lot of work on place attachment and place meaning, and so I share some of the prior skepticism. But another sort of thing that seems to come up to me is that people may have different willingness to accept if we're talking about individual moves versus communities relocating. And how does that concept or difference fit within your thinking and your model?
That's a great question. So in related research, we're trying to think more about how to get people to accept different buyout strategies. And one of the things that has come up in our review of the literature is that people tend to, like, some people are just really attached to their neighbors. So if you can guarantee to them that you and your 3 neighbors are going to move to this new community and still be neighbors in that new place, their willingness to move may really benefit from that. So again, that goes towards being precise. Like in this idea of contingent valuation, it is supposed to be contingent on exactly what the scenario is. And so I think what you're saying is, like, we want to give them, we want to describe the true scenario. If we are able to accommodate them moving as a group, then that should be described to them, and that will really affect what willingness to accept they state in that case. So I completely agree with you. It will definitely affect their valuations. And I totally agree with you that that's something we should think about more, how we can preserve communities in these type of relocation scenarios, because that seems to be something that people really value. And so in our other study, we're actually modeling this kind of community attachment and trying to understand how we can get neighbors to coordinate to move together. Did that answer your question, Jeremy?
Yeah, it does. I guess the other question is whether you looked at, or whether you think there's value of looking at, I mean, people may value something if they think differently, if they think it's me having to move versus this is all part of a larger societal movement, that I'm not just being signaled out. And, you know, we do find with energy infrastructure that people are more willing to accept or have a better attitude towards energy infrastructure near them if it's part of an energy transition. It's not a one-off. And so how does that come into play in your work as well?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that kind of goes towards being transparent in how we target communities. I think there's a lot of criticism of buyout programs at the moment saying, I mean, in part because funding is constrained, so it's cheaper to buy out homes that are cheaper to buy out. And so you might end up always targeting the kind of lower income communities through that. And then lower income communities might push back saying, you're moving us from the coast while all the wealthier communities get to stay in these coastal landscapes. So that's something that you want to be really aware of. And I think that goes towards the point that Siders raised in her 2019 paper on the slide, that just this cost benefit logic can only get you so far. And then further to your point, I agree that if we have a more broad understanding of why these types of buyouts are needed and why some communities are better relocated than defended through seawalls, in part because seawalls tend to create externalities down the road on other communities, then it may be more acceptable to people to participate in these types of programs. So not feeling singled out is certainly important here. Badri, do you have a question?
Okay, yeah. Well, thank you, Christina. It is a very well presentation. So I have one question about like how you are planning to ask about the losses into the like a buyout experiment, because you know, like if you ask it will be the complete loss of the house or property, or like partial loss, that makes a difference based on like loss aversion principle, like if the marginal difference of a perception of gain and loss is will decrease with the increased magnitude of the loss. So are you asking like your property will be like, if you saw like a virtual reality, you will show like a half of your property loss or complete loss, or if you ask like you losing your property means like you losing whole of your property or like a half of. I think that makes a difference in their responses for willingness to pay and willingness to accept.
Yeah, it certainly does. So we tried to research this for our related work on kind of getting communities to move as a group. And what we find is that like the average damage to a home is, I think, $50,000, which is probably not close, like maybe close to half of the home value for some homes, but not for all. So there's this kind of substantial damage threshold that's 50% of the home. That's kind of considered an extreme case. So I don't think we would ever frame it as your house completely gets washed away and is gone. It would always be a financial damage to your home. But the idea is that, I mean, if you have insurance, you're somewhat protected. But if you don't have insurance, then still making the idea is these are homes that get repeatedly and severely damaged. So you would have, let's say, $50,000 of damage every 5 years. And so that's kind of how we would frame the question. It's not a huge loss. It's not wiping out your entire property, but it's a substantial financial setback that's potentially going to repeat over time.
I see. And one question on your experiment, like the chocolate experiment. So, like I was a part of this kind of experiment in Nebraska, and it was like a class experiment, and it had like an effect of how hungry you are. Like even you are participating after the lunch, some people might have skip the lunch for that day. So how did you manage like that kind of experiment on that?
So that's a great question. And we were worried about that at first, but the nice thing that we see in our evaluation study is that while willingness to accept comes down, willingness to pay actually goes up. And so if everybody was just, I've eaten a piece of chocolate now I don't want any more, we should see both willingness to pay and willingness to accept come down. But instead what we see is that the dominating factor is that exploring the kind of chocolate raised people's willingness to pay and lowered willingness to accept, which kind of goes against this idea of satiation that you raised. So that's a great question. And yeah, we did think through that.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? These are really interesting questions.
Well, if there's no more questions, we certainly want to thank you for your talk today, Christina. It's been both making me hungry and intellectually stimulated at the same time. So we really appreciate it. And again, we're very happy that you're here at the University of Delaware and working with Project WiCCED on these efforts. And we look forward to seeing this work progress over time. It's really an important issue for not only our state, but obviously as global of importance. So thank you, Christina. Please join me in thanking her.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Project WiCCED, for hosting me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.